Welcome to Planning Ahead with CMS. In part 2 of our environmental impact series, we talked about the potential problem areas for environmental statements. Today, in the third and final episode, we're going to consider in broad terms what type of information should be included in an environmental statement. And we've got a special guest, Katie, from our infrastructure consenting team, who's going to tell us all about it. So then, Katie, sometimes I hear the term Rochdale envelope when we're talking about defining a project. What does that mean?
So Nicola, the Rochdale or the design envelope is a principle which allows the scale, the design, or the size of a project to be defined with agreed maximum or sometimes minimum parameters, which are set for the purposes of assessing likely significant effects. Now, what this envelope essentially gives a promoter extra flexibility when preparing their application in circumstances where the specifics of a proposed development haven't yet been determined.
So that's really interesting. Could you give us some examples of how that works?
Of course. So possibly thinking, say, a wind farm promoter might not necessarily know how many turbines, say, are going to be in the final design, but it can create this project envelope of a maximum amount of turbines. And what this does is it allows the assessment of the likely effect of a worst case scenario.
And would that be precise enough for an environmental statement?
Yeah, so as long as enough information has been provided to allow the decision maker to understand the main and the significant effects of the project on the environment, they won't be penalized for, say, a lack of precision. But clearly, the broader the parameters are, the more difficult it can be to assess them. So it's really this fine balancing exercise to get a robust yet a flexible project envelope. Now, an envelope will be comprised of many different parameters. So thinking of a wind farm again, you have things like number of turbines, height, rotor diameter, and so on.
Great, thanks Katie. So how are the main and significant effects actually assessed in the statement?
So the environmental statement will need to report on the significance of any effects of the proposed development against the environmental receptors, which are identified in, say, the scoping opinion or the environmental assessment or environmental statement itself. Now, a receptor, that's a term which is something that's been identified as being particularly susceptible or vulnerable to effects caused by the proposed development. So for example, thinking again of, say, an offshore wind farm in this context, you might have individual species of marine mammals or certain types of seabirds, which are almost always going to be a receptor that needs to be assessed. Alternatively, you can have really quite broad receptors, such as, say, human health. Now, once your receptors have been identified, the EIA will report on the impact caused by the development on that receptor. So that is whether the impact is a significant one.
So that's fascinating, but is there anything that as a promoter you can do to sort of reduce or mitigate the impacts of those things?
So firstly, it's worth noting that impacts can actually be beneficial, but where you have adverse effects then, however, the promoter does need to consider ways to either avoid those entirely or to minimize them. And so we look at something called mitigation measures. Now, mitigation measures can include mitigation that's kind of inherent to the design of the project, or they can be secondary measures, such as methods of construction that a developer commits to adopt. So thinking again of the example of marine mammals, say, a developer might commit to using a form of soft drilling rather than hard drilling to make sure that they have fewer effects on the species. Now, alternatively, you can also have something called ongoing monitoring measures, and those are something that you can be required to commit to as part of planning conditions or obligations.
So I've heard about cumulative effects in the context of environmental statements. What does that mean and where does it fit in?
So cumulative assessments are almost always a part of an EIA. Now, a promoter has to consider how their project will fit into a cumulative package. Now, this can be considering either different environmental impacts from the project itself, so these are called intra-project effects, or it can be looking at how the project will sit with a wider portfolio of projects in the area, inter-project effects.
So what does that mean in practice?
So for example, the effects of a development on a certain species might include loss of habitat, noise disturbance, or impacts on the supply of food. And taken individually, each of those impacts might be minor or minimal, but taken together, they could be really significant and adverse. Secondly, you might have a situation where the assessment of a proposed development by itself might be fine, but it's actually once it's taken cumulatively with other wind farms in an area or kind of other developments in an area that actually you realize that there is a significant impact. Now, promoters need to cumulatively assess these effects to make sure that the surrounding operations and activities are factored into the decision maker's decision. And the boundary for these cumulative assessments can actually be really quite wide. Now, cumulative assessments usually have much more significant conclusions than project alone ones. So it's really an area that developers need to be prepared for and need to make sure they give sufficient consideration.
Thank you, Katie. And this is the end of our series on environmental impacts. Thank you very much for your time today, and please tune in to the next series of Planning Ahead with CMS, where we will be focusing on highways.